The Torah tells us many mitzvahs, and we have 613 commandments, 613 biblical commandments, and the commentators count them in different ways. Everyone agrees to the final number of 613, but if you look at the Monei HaMitzvahs, they have different type of mitzvahs, and they have to explain why they included one and not the other. So, since we have so many mitzvahs all the time, it's not an unlikely scenario when certain times we can't perform a mitzvah. I don't mean choosing not to do one, being nullifying a mitzvah, but circumstances have it that prevent you, circumstances out of your control that prevent you from doing a mitzvah. And the term in the Gemara is known as ones rachmana patre. That ones, if it's a case of duress, rachmana the Torah, God, patre exempts you. So how far does that principle go? Ones rachmana patre. So there's an interesting piece from Rabbi Yosef Engel in the Ason Daraisa, where he discusses, he says, B'misha anos milakayim mitzvahs aseh. Someone is an onus in fulfilling a positive mitzvah. Hayim patu agamre mikiyim ha-mitzvah. Is he exempt completely from the fulfillment of the mitzvah when a person is not going to do it? But how do we view this exemption? Is he patu agamre? Do we say, that's it, since he's in a state of onus, he is no longer obligated in this mitzvah? O dilma kate mechayevu, or I say no, he's still obligated, but he's just not able to fulfill it. How do we view ones rachmana patre? Is it a total exemption? It's a hafka, you no longer even, for this specific time, the mitzvah no longer even relates to you? Or no? Of course the mitzvah relates to you, it's just a personal exemption. I can't do it, but the chiyuv still stands. Umasik Hasam, and Rabbi Yosef Engel concludes, he says, well, it depends. There yesh shnei mine mitzvahs. There are two different categories of commandments. As we know, as is illustrated by the Aseret HaDibros, the 10 commandments, the 10 principles, which are given on the 2 tablets. And the first tablet represents mitzvahs ben adam lamakom, commandments between us, between man and God. And the second side of the tablet is ben adam lechavero, interpersonal laws between people. And that's why at first glance kibbud av v'aim is on the wrong side of the tablets. However, they point out that it really isn't, because it's a perfect transition, because ben adam lamakom, our commandments to our Creator, as the Gemara tells us in Kedushin, we all have 3 creators, Mommy, Daddy, and God, and therefore it's a perfect transition from mitzvahs ben adam lamakom to mitzvahs ben adam lechavero, between commandments between man and God and commandments between man and man. And therefore, it's the perfect transition. So that's what they point out. So there are 2 categories of mitzvahs, mitzvahs ben adam lamakom and mitzvahs ben adam lechavero. So Rabbi Yosef Engel wants to say regarding mitzvahs ben adam lamakom, he says, hasvara no senis, the logic dictates that God's not going to come and have tainas on us, umechayev ach es misha yachol kayim ha-mitzvah ano ze'eno mechuyev klal. He wants to say that a mitzvah ben adam lamakom, in a mitzvah ben adam lamakom, you're not mechuyev at all, because God's not going to ask from something that it's not possible to fulfill. However, he writes, by mitzvahs ben adam lechavero, and his examples are asiyas maka, making a fence around the roof, priyas balcho, paying back money, besides it being a mitzvah, but it's mitzad to'eles chavero. You're obviously helping someone else. Uvavade lo nemar bekamo zeh dimhu anu she'ein yochel asos ma'isa she'ein hadavar ba'atzmuso v'sarochi yos tuvada nitzrach v'chein ba'al chayit. So therefore he says, by a mitzvah bet amul makom, he says, ela she'anu she'ein yochel kayim, that basically the chiyuv is still there, the person still needs help, except I personally, the to'elis is still needed, I just personally can't do it. So basically, Rabbi Yosef Engel makes a distinction between mitzvahs ben am l'makom and mitzvahs ben adam l'chavero. That by mitzvahs, so why is Rabbi Yosef Engel say that by mitzvahs ben adam l'makom you considered pato l'gamrei, while mitzvahs ben adam l'chavero you still consider you still have a chiyuv. The chiyuv is still there, because so it's based on what we've discussed many times, that the focus of mitzvahs ben adam l'makom is the ma'isa mitzvah. The two types of commandments. The one type is the Torah is concerned with the act, the ma'isa, and other times the Torah is concerned with the result. In other words, Rosaseh kol malacha, on Shabbos is a prohibition to do malacha, creative activity. So the Torah is concerned with the Maisa, with the Malacha. So therefore there's many halachas if you do it with a different intention. A Malacha, Shein Tzrichu, a Gufa, Kol Achad, you do it in non-normative ways, so it lowers the level of Chiyuv to, let's say, only a rabbinical prohibition. So when the Torah is interested in the Maisa, if you do it without the Maisa, or if you don't use the Maisa, or if you do it in a non-normative way, so then the punishment is mitigated. However, when it comes to Adam HaChavero, the purpose is the To'eles Chavero, it's to help, it's the Totzah, to help your friend, and therefore, bottom line, by hook or by crook, if you didn't help your friend, if you're not helping anyone. And that's why, of course, that's the distinction of Machshava Tova, that when it comes to a Machshava Tova, Mitzdaref L'maisa, as the Koy Chemda points out, so then we say Machshava Tova, Mitzdaref L'maisa, when it comes to mitzvahs ben l'makam, because God knows your intention. But when it comes to ben chavero, you could have all the best thoughts in the world, but if I only thought about visiting the sick in the hospital, nichum avelim, going to a kfura, or acts of chesed, we live in the olam hasiya, and therefore the chiyuv is still there. In fact, that's the famous Papa Reb Yonis in Eipshitz, how he explains in the beginning of Parashas Vayeshev Yaakov Eretz Megar Aviv, and Chazal tell us Bikesh Yaakov Leishe Bashalba, and they find fault with him. So why did they find fault with him? What's wrong with wanting to spend time retiring and going to Kollel learning? So the Rav Yonasan Hapshin explains because why did Yaakov think it was time to Leishe Bashalva? Because he said that was the brachas. V'itala Shamayim Mishmani, and we give the Tala Shamayim Mishmani Aretz. I got the brachas, so therefore I deserve to retire now. So he said, and right afterwards we find the parasha of Mechiras Yosef. And what led to the problem of the sin of Yosef and hence the Mechiras? Because Yaakov is playing favorites, so to speak, with Yisrael Ahav as Yosef. He gave him the Ksonis Pasem, so the brothers were very upset. Why did Yaakov give it? Because since she was supposed to marry Rachel, and therefore he was going to be the Bechor b'Machshava. He was supposed to be the Bechor, he only ended up being the Bechor b'Machshava, and Reuven was Bechor b'Maisa. So nevertheless he favored Joseph. There are other reasons also. So how did he go? He went Basa Machshava, not Basa Maisa. And then we see, when it came to the brachas, he got the brachas, but it was supposed to be for Esav. So he says, just like you went Lamaisa with the brachas, the bottom line you have to go Lamaisa and Reuven's the Bechor. And therefore, the punishment and this whole story of Mechiras Yosef. And that's why we pointed out, we live in an Olam Hasiya, we live in the world of doing, not in the world of Machshava, and therefore one has to go ahead and actually do the act. And in fact, that's what we find by the famous Avnei Nezer, there's a Meshach Chochma, we'll do the Meshach Chochma. The pasuk in Parashas Bo talks about the mitzvah of Yerushamarta Zechuka Azos Ben Yam Yamima Machokes. In the Gemara, what is the pasuk referring to? So whether it's Karban Pesach or Tefillin. So the Mechilta writes it's talking about Tefillin, and he learns out from it. There's a mitzvah min Torah. You have to check your Tefillin once a year. So the Meshach Chochma points out, and based on this Mechilta, the Mishkanas Yaakov wants to say, and others want to say, that there's a mitzvah also, bedika as well, by checking the lungs of an animal. That the halach is there are many treifas in the animal, but we only check the lungs. Why? Because the Ramban writes, because Minat Torah, if you have 50% good, so you could eat it. Minat Torah. And if it's less than a 10% chance, well, we'll assume 10%, as the Mishkan Yaakov says. But if it's a miyat she'eino matzoi, so you can eat it also. But a miyat hamatzoi, which the Mishkan Yaakov says 10%, then you have a chiyah b'dika midrabanan. It's not limited to lungs, it's the same halacha by vegetables or any type of b'dika. So the halacha is, the Mishkan Yaakov says we have a mitzvah, we have a chiyah b'dika on the lungs, because it's anything which is a miyad hamatzah, we have a chiyah b'dika. So the Meshach Chochma wants to be machalik between the chiyah b'dika regarding the lungs and the chiyah b'dika on the tefillin. The chiyah b'dika on the lungs, that's only a din d'Rabbanan. Why? Because minat Torah you're permitted to eat it, and therefore, so if it turns out that you ended up eating treif, so therefore you're exonerated, because it wasn't by you might need a level of tshuva, etc., but by hook or by crook, you could get out of it in terms of to be a kapara, or you might not need one. He says Masha'in came by tefillin, which is a mitzvah aseh, that requires a bedika, because why? It's true, you won't be punished for not wearing tefillin, but you're not going to get the mitzvah either. Ones commando of it, it's only Ones considers you like get into it, doesn't give you credit for doing it. And as Rav Chaim used to always say, and others, that you could have all the excuses in the world why you can't learn today, you can't learn tonight, I have this excuse and that excuse, and they're all great excuses. But never, you're still an Am Haaretz. If you didn't learn anything, you still don't know anything either. That's what the Avnei Nezer writes regarding Chanukah. That the Rambam's Rosh, mitzvah chaviva ad ma'od, that the mitzvah pursuing Nisa, it seems there are many mitzvahs in the Torah the Rambam doesn't make a big deal out of, and selling your clothes off to fulfill the mitzvah. So the Avnei Nezer, because by other mitzvahs, even though that might be minat Torah, so you might have a chiyuv if you don't do it, onis rachmana patre, if you can't do it. When it comes to Chanukah, it's true, onis rachmana patre, but there's a mitzvah pursuing Nisa. So you won't be able to fulfill the pursuing Nisa, so even though you might have a good excuse, but pursuing Nisa, you're not going to have. So that's what, so we see, so Rabbi Yosef Engel made a distinction between mitzvahs ben adam l'makom and adam l'chaver. When it comes to ben adam l'makom, we say ones rachmana patre. When it comes to mitzvahs ben adam l'chavero, we don't, because the chiyuv is still there. And then perhaps we made a further distinction. Maybe even within ben adam l'makom, is a difference between a mitzvah aseh and a los aseh. A lo saseh machiras chametz by hook or by crook, you avoided the Yisr, so therefore you're okay. But when it comes to a mitzvah aseh, it's not enough. You might not be punished for not doing it, but you're not going to be. So you might not be liable. So you don't have a chiyuv to check your tefillin. Okay, and you might have a chiyuv b'dika, but if the tefillin aren't kosher, you don't get the mitzvah of tefillin. And that's what the Meshach Chochmah Kiddush is, that perhaps by tefillin, it's a mitzvah min HaTorah to check because it's a mitzvah aseh. And that's what the Avnei Nezer says, why the Rambam singles out one of the few mitzvahs near Chanukah, mitzvah chaviva, and you have to even sell the even an ani has to try to get involved with the mitzvah because there's an angle per sumei nisa. You might be exempt from the near Chanukah, and however, the per sumei nisa is only fulfilled through an active maisa of lighting Chanukah candles, and therefore the Avnei Nezer explains that's why one has to go to great lengths. We find by near Chanukah more so than by other mitzvahs aseh. An onain is someone who is exempt from mitzvahs. An onain is not the person who died. The person who died meisim chavshim min ha-mitzvahs, but the relatives who are taking care of the burial, so they have a status midrabanan of not being involved in mitzvahs. In other words, min HaTorah, there are different halachas regarding karbanos, ma'aser sheni, that we don't have today. So what we have is the din of misa meso mutu lefanav, the beginning of the third parak in brachas. It deals with the exemption of mitzvahs. An onain, as we'll see, is exempt and perhaps prohibited from doing mitzvahs. There's also an isser of basar v'yayin as well for an onain. An onain cannot partake in meat and wine. An avel can. In fact, the whole Chazal tell us one of the whole reasons why wine was created was genachem es avel, is to comfort the mourner. And some have a custom of a sudas havra, believe even to have meat at the meal. So basar v'yayin is permitted after the funeral, but the time of aninus, between the death and the burial, there's an isser of basar v'yayin, there's an isser of meat and wine, and there's a petor mitzvahs. So what is this petor mitzvahs based on? So it seems to be a machlokes Rashi and Tosfos, perhaps also the Tshuvas Harashba. To Rashi and others point out, there's a discussion, there's a concept of osek b'mitzvah pater min ha-mitzvah. When a person is involved in one mitzvah, they're exempt from another mitzvah. So they're involved in the mitzvah of kvura, so therefore they're exempt from other mitzvahs. Others learn similar tirda, that you won't be able to focus on what you're doing because your mind's on the mace, on sarchei ha-mace, and therefore that's why you're exempt. So according to these schools of thought, whether it's osek b'mitzvah of a tirda, so then one can entertain. But if you feel you can transcend the situation, then you can and perhaps should do the mitzvah. However, Tosfos quotes from the Yerushalmi, Tosfos in Brachas, in the beginning of the third parak, that al kavod amez lo eglo rosh. One is prohibited from doing mitzvahs because it looks like you're making a mockery of the dead. Like, I can do mitzvahs, you can't. So therefore, al kavod amez, honor to the dead, one does not do mitzvahs. I'm not getting into it now, but that's the whole discussion today with the Chevra Kadisha and other people. If you're no longer taking care of the mace, whether you have the status of an onain anymore. But regarding the general status of an onain is pater min ha-mitzvahs. There seems to be a machlokes Rashi and Tosfos, another Rishonim, on what is the nature of the exemption. So we paskin that, like the Bali Tosfos, like the Yerushalmi, al kavod amez, and not only not only are you exempt from mitzvahs, but you are prohibited from doing mitzvahs. And in fact, though, that's the famous Pischei Tshuva, other Achronim, the Minchas Chinuch. What about in a situation where you have a mitzvah and an isser at the same time? So, for instance, the classical case is you want to eat bread. An Oni doesn't have to fast, an Oni is exempt from brachas as well. So, let's say to eat bread, there's a mitzvah midrabanan of washing your hands before you eat bread. And as well, there's an isser drabanan to eat bread without washing. So what does an onein do? So the Pischei Tshuva quotes from the different achronim, wash your hands without a bracha. How does that help? Wash your hands without a bracha. What kind of compromise in that is that? So, because the halacha is, we only make a bracha when we're fulfilling a mitzvah and the performance of a mitzvah. We don't make a bracha when we do something to avoid an isser. If we're just avoiding an isser, we do not make a bracha. So regarding the mitzvah midrabanan of washing your hands before eating bread, that you're exempt from, that's sasa to do. So why am I washing my hands then? I'm washing my hands because even though an onein is pater from mitzvahs aseh, it's pater from positive mitzvahs, but not from negative, not from an isser aseh, not from a lav, and therefore an onein has to wash his hands, so he's not in violation of eating bread without washing your hands. So the only reason you're doing it is to avoid the isser. Anytime you do something to avoid the prohibition, and not for the mitzvah, we don't make a bracha. That's what the Minchas Chinuch raises as well regarding an onein during Sukkot. That summons an onein to this discussion, what should the onein do? Should he eat in the sukkah or not? Because the Minchas Chinuch raises, in addition to the mitzvahs aseh of eating in the sukkah, there's perhaps an isser aseh to eat chutz sukkah, and an onein is not allowed to do prohibitions. So the Minchas Chinuch discusses the same issue, perhaps eat in the sukkah without a bracha. Again, why eat in the sukkah without a bracha? Because alps the mitzvahs aseh of doing the mitzvahs you're exempt from. Why are you only doing the mitzvah? To avoid the isser of eating chutz sukkah. So that if you're doing something to avoid an isser, you did not make a bracha. In fact, that's what the Rosh writes in Chulin. We know the different types of washings. There's mayim rishonim, we're familiar with. We wash our hands before we eat bread. There's mayim achronim, where different customs of discussion among the achronim, whether one is obligated to do mayim achronim today, whether since the Magen Avram raises, since we don't have melech sedomis, maybe we don't. The Mishnah Berurah, others say you should do it. There are other reasons to do it. So different minhagim. But there's a concept of mayim rishonim or mayim achronim. In fact, some even say we don't pass in this way. We don't make a bracha on mayim achronim. But some say you have bracha. Some even say if you don't have enough water for mayim achronim, then you can't even wash to begin with. We don't pass in that way. But just to show how there are strong shitas regarding mayim achronim. However, the Rosh raises another type of washing. That's what he calls mayim emsam, the middle waters. What is the middle waters? Washing your hands in the middle of a meal? Well, kind of. But there's a prohibition in the Torah, Savasha Gedi Bachal Avimo. There's a prohibition in the Chumash. It says there's 3 times one is not permitted to cook milk and meat together. And we learn out Echa, one L'Isser Achila, Echa L'Isser Hana, one for cooking. You can't cook basar v'chalav, you can't eat it, you can't get benefit. So that's the din daraisa. There's a minig brought down, the Gemara has strong language for it. Al Sakana, the Gemara says one is not permitted to cook fish and meat together because it's going to cause a davar acher, it's going to cause some serious sickness. Rashi talks about it, leprosy. Either way, it's not a good thing to have fish and meat together, and that's how and that's again, it's a discussion whether bisman hazeh, the the custom among Klal Yisrael is we are machmir to not to have fish and meat together. But there's a discussion in Rishon and Achronim whether since today, scientifically speaking, we don't find any danger, how far we have to go today. That's a machlokas in the Shach and Taz regarding, we know the halacha is if a little milk falls into the chicken soup, so there's a halacha bitul b'shishim, that milk becomes nullified and the food is kosher. What happens if a little fish falls into meat? So some say it's the same halacha as milk and meat, that we say it's batul b'shishim. Other achronim point out that the Gemara tells us chamira sakanta me'isura. We are more strict when it comes to danger than when it comes to isser. So therefore, when it comes to danger, we're more strict. So therefore, even if a tiny bit of fish falls into the meat, we don't eat it. In fact, that was the whole discussion with the OU, COR, in terms of this Worcestershire type of sauce, which had fish in it, and people use it on meat products. So I'm not sure what they do today, but at one point they weren't mentioning anything about fish. So I've seen different bottles say OU fish, others that say OU. So I'm not sure what the current practice is, but I heard at one point Rav Schechter said that it depends if it's more than, so obviously if it's more than shishim, you're going to have OU fish on it. But let's say it's shishim. So Rav Schechter's shita was that it's a sveka, because one suffix is maybe we don't have to worry anymore. The Magen Avraham paskins, you don't have to worry about fish and meat. I think it's the Rambam as well. It doesn't list it. And even if you assume it is a problem, but it's a machokas shach and taz, whether it's batul b'shishim. So therefore, if it was less than shishim, so maybe they didn't put OU fish on, even though, because I looked in the ingredients, I saw anchovies in it, and yet it didn't, so they must be based on the sveka. The Rav Schechter that OU's following. Again, it's constantly changing. I checked that up. I looked at it, I think, last summer when I was in the Catskills in Walmart, and that's what I saw, but I'm not sure if that is what the current practice is. So either way, there's a prohibition, a strong minhag today out Sakana of not having fish and meat together. So in fact, that's how some bring down it. We know there's a famous minhag Yisrael of saying l'chayim, that people have a cup of wine, schnapps, a drink, and they say, where does it come from? So many different schools of thought. We gave a share on in the past. I'm sure we'll discuss it again in the future. But one reason Nogea to us here, so one school of thought is that since the minhag is to separate the fish and the meat, so after you have the gefilte fish or whatever fish you're going to have, and before you bring out the meat, so besides getting a new fork, new silverware, a new plate, so you know that you wash out your mouth, you wash off your hands. So one of the ways was you have a little drink or l'chayim in between to get rid of the taste of the fish. So besides the l'chayim, one of the things is you wash your hands. So that's what the Rosh says. It's mayim emsam, the middle waters. Why do we drink the middle waters? To separate fish and meat, so we shouldn't have the danger of fish and meat together. So therefore, that's why the Rosh points out, you never make a bracha mayim emsam, because the only reason you're doing it is to avoid an isser. In fact, that's the Gemara in Psachim. The Gemara in Psachim, and it talks about habodek sarach lavarach. The Gemara writes the Avzayin in the beginning, in the first parak, it talks about the mitzvah of bito chametz and the mitzvah of bedikas chametz. Bito belev sagi, you'll nullify it in your heart. You say, I don't want any chametz belonging to me. And then you do a bedika, or you do a bedika first and the bito. But the Gemara says abodek sarach shiyavarach. So what's the question? Of course, we know the Gemara tells us in Psachim that before we do a mitzvah, usually before, sometimes after, but we make a bracha over la'asiyosam. We make the bracha first, and then we do the mitzvah. The Gemara says the classic exception is a ger. Obviously, before they go into the mikveh, they're not Jewish, so they can't make the bracha on the geras until after the mikveh. But generally speaking, you make the bracha before. So, a bolding sarakal baritz, of course, you got to make a bracha on medikas chametz. What's the havamina? So the Rishonim discuss the havamina was that the whole reason behind the main purpose of medikas chametz was to avoid the prohibition of al yirah b'al yimata. In addition to not eating chametz on Pesach, in addition, there's a prohibition not to own chametz, a biblical prohibition about yirah b'al yimata. And some Rishonim learn that's like a biblical get there. Usually you find the rabbis make a fence around to protect the biblical law, but sometimes the Rabbi Yosef Engel, others point out that the Torah makes a biblical fence. So this could be one of them, about yirah b'al yimata. So you do b'dikas chametz, so you avoid the problem about yirah b'al yimata. So therefore, I might have thought the whole reason for the mitzvah, the main purpose of b'dikas chametz is to avoid the iser. Kamash malan, no, b'dikas chametz is a mitzvah b'fnei atzma. And also that's a discussion regarding as well the issue of sisa maka. There's a mitzvah in our Torah of building if you have a flat roof and people use the roof, so you put a fence around your roof, or perhaps the modern day equivalent, a fence around the pool. So there's a discussion among the Rishonim Achronim, do you make a bracha on the mitzvah of Makkah, and what bracha do you make? If you do make a bracha, but what's one of the main nekudas there on whether you make a bracha or not, because Makkah is l'sasam dam veisecha, that it's to avoid bloodshed, to avoid people shouldn't fall off the roof and die. So obviously those who say you don't make a bracha seem to say the main function of it is to avoid the issur l'sasam dam veisecha. The others who say you do make a bracha, they focus on there's an independent and positive mitzvah the Torah gave to build the Makkah. So that's it. So we find this klal, and that's what the Pischei Tshuva and other Achronim write regarding Anina. So an onin is patur min ha-mitzvahs, and we paskin not only see patur min ha-mitzvahs, we paskin an onin is prohibited from doing a mitzvah, and that's why we find that when it comes to sitting in the sukkah or washing the tihot shadayim, he has to wash his hands without a bracha, because anytime you're doing an act to avoid an issue, you don't make a bracha, and that was the concept of mayim emsam, the middle waters between fish and meat, and that was the havamin of the Gemara of abodig sarakal barak, that maybe b'dikas chametz is only coming to avoid an issur, and that's perhaps also the machlokes Rishonim Achronim regarding vasisa maka gagecha, putting a maka on your roof, whether you make a bracha now, whether it's an independent mitzvah or whether it's just there. Its primary purpose is to avoid an issur. I had a shaila yesterday from an onain. An onain is someone from the time they lost one of the 7 relatives, they lost one of their loved ones, and it was before the burial. And the din min ha-Torah has to do with karbanos, ma'aser sheni l'chalti b'oni mimeni. But midrabanan is the din of patur mitzvahs, exemption from mitzvahs. So the shiloh it was Friday afternoon, and the funeral wasn't going to happen until Sunday. So he wanted to know. Someone told them that he should daven mincha a little later than usual, which is pretty hard since he says he davens right before Shkia as is, but he should daven a couple minutes later than he usually does, and it's okay for him to daven mincha on Erev Shabbos. So he wanted to know if that was correct. Is there a shita like that? Because Pashtus, if you're an onain, so you're an onain until Shabbos, and therefore you should be patur from mincha, and perhaps, depending on the machlokas Rashi and Tosas, not only patur, but out covered on mace, maybe it's even a problem to daven. So we'll discuss that shaila. But before we get to the specific question of davening mincha on Erev Shabbos, we need some background info. So what is this basis? How does it work? The Beis Yosef brings it down, others. How can it be a minat Torah? And mincha happens to be a mitzvah midrabanan. But even mitzvahs minat Torah, let's assume Havdalah or Tefillin, any other mitzvahs that a person has to do, and only is exempt from. So that's a Torah mitzvah is only a din d'Rabbanan. So how could the rabbis uproot a mitzvah minat Torah? That's the Gemara in Yevamos. Yesh koach b'yad chachamim la'akor dvar Torah b'shei v'al taseh. That there's a power among the chachamim that have to uproot a mitzvah by telling you not to do. They can't tell you to violate a kum v'aseh. There is an opinion like that in the Gemara. We paskin b'shei v'al taseh. In other words, they can't tell you if you're having a Mac attack. They can't tell you to go to McDonald's. That's b'kum v'aseh. If they can merely tell you not to perform, so don't put on tefillin, that is only b'shei v'al taseh. So there's a concept of yesh koach b'yad chachamim la'akor dvar Torah b'shei v'al taseh. However, as the Bach and other Achronim and the Taz point out, there are different limitations to this principle. In other words, how much power do the Chachamim have? So number one is, they can only tell you not to do something if it's not mafurish b'kra. In other words, there's a famous Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, but Rosh Hashanah shachol yos b'Shabbos, when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos. So the halacha is that the Gzeira d'Rabba, the rabbis tell us no shofar today. So how could they tell you no shofar? Yesh koach b'yad chachamim la'akor dvar Torah b'shei v'al taseh. So I think the Bach, some Achronim ask, okay, so we know we have a principle on Shabbos and Yontiv not to play a musical instrument. Gzeira shem yisaken klishir. You might come to fix the musical instrument. So the question is, how can we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah? The rabbi should say, no shofar, we're afraid you might come to fix it. Number one is, perhaps you can't fix the shofar, or maybe it's not a musical instrument, but assuming it is, so what is the answer? So that's what the Achronim answer. The last I checked, every Rosh Hashanah always falls out on Yontif. So if we said no shofar on Yontif, will be oker mitzvah minat Torah of shofar. Well, gamrei will be oker the mitzvah completely, not the rabbis can't do it. The rabbis only do it temporarily for a certain time period. So if it's mafurish b'kra, they can't tell you not to do it. Similarly, you find it's a famous Taz regarding macholos hasuras. In general, even though by isser basa v'cholav, there's an issue of cooking it, eating it, and getting hanas. You can't be in the business. You can't sell basa b'cholav products. You're getting hana. However, it's a separate exemption of chelav, a certain fat. The Torah says that you can get benefit from. You can be in the business. So how could the Chachamim can't tell you no because it's Meferis, it's Mefurish in the Torah. Or for instance, as we mentioned Gzeira d'Rabba, we say there's no shofar on Shabbos, there's no lulav on the first day of Yantif, no dalad minim, and no purim on Shabbos. That's heimamru v'heimamru. Only a din d'Rabbanan perhaps. So the question is, why don't we apply the klal of Gzeira d'Rabba by Mila? So there are many answers, but one answer given is that we can't, since the Taz right, it says Yom HaShmini, and the Gemara learns Afil v'Shabbos, and the Taz learns Yud Gimel Midos is considered Mefurish B'Kra. So therefore, since it's Mefurish B'Kra, that we have Mila on Shabbos, so the rabbis can't come along and say no Mila on Shabbos. So we see the principle is limited if it's not Mefurish B'Kra. So as long as it's not Mefurish B'Kra, the Chachamim, so by an onin, Yesh koach b'yad chachamim l'kvor b'Torah b'shei v'al taseh, and we pass in Tosfos that Kvod Shameis, it's even usher to do. So the question is, how far does that extension go? Because on one hand, because the Yerushalmi talks about until you give it over, until you give it over and they carry it on their shoulders. Once that point reaches, so then you become chayiv in mitzvah. So in fact, the Chachmas Adam quotes this, and other is a minority view, but the some Acharonim say the Bizman Hazeh, that we have a Chevra Kadisha. We don't even touch the body goes right to them and they take care of everything. So the whole exemption of an owning pater min mitzvahs doesn't apply today, because we're not being osek b'meis, and therefore we're chayiv in mitzvahs. The Noda B'Yehuda says, and that seems to be our opinion, we reject this opinion, and we still assume an owning is chayiv in mitzvahs. So why do we reject it? Because the Noda B'Yehuda says that's only if someone, the Yerushalmi is talking about the case where you carried, the people were involved in the mace, and they're taking it up until, let's say, the end of the city, Shara Air, was too dangerous or difficult for people to go. Then they were finished now. They're going to go home now and sit Shiva. So then, once you finish that, you're no longer pater min mitzvahs. But in our case, you're still involved with the maze. You're getting ready. Who do you have to put an announcement in the paper? You have to write the obituary. You have to write the hesped. You have to tell people. You're constantly being torrid b'meis. So therefore, you're constantly being torrid b'meis, and therefore the exemption still applies. And that's what we assume. We assume that, like the Noda B'Yehuda. However, there's a very interesting psak in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and it's very nogea, because today, with flights, in fact, in the Torah it talks about it, Parshas Vayechi, that Yaakov asked Yosef to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Take me out of Mitzrayim, I'll not take reign of Mitzrayim, get me into Israel. And that's a discussion, Bizman Hazeh, and not only Bizman Hazeh, is this a practice for everybody? Some say it's just for the Gedolei Yisrael, just for Tzadikim. Why do you bring Tamei Meis body there? Why do you bring Tumah to Eretz Yisrael? Others say no, it's for everybody. So either way, different minhagim. So the many today will have the custom of, even if they lived in Chutz La'aretz, to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. So obviously to get to Eretz Yisrael, you have to go by plane. They're not going to take a boat today. So usually you have the body underneath, and I'm assuming you're on the plane. So Rav Shlomo Zalman has a big chiddush. He wants to say, before you go on the plane, you're an onein, you're an osek b'kfura, so you pater min mitzvahs. When you get on the plane, there's nothing for you to do, the body's underneath, you're chayiv in mitzvahs. You got to do everything, whatever the mitzvahs come up during that time period, davening, making brachas, etc. you have to do. And when you get off the plane, so then you become your osek b'kfura again, and therefore you're exempt. So that's a big chiddush of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. In fact, I heard that he pointed out that from the Nishmas Avram, who was very close to him, that when his wife passed away, and he was going home by, I don't know, he was getting a car ride, a taxi, however he was, they were driving back together. And he told the Nishmas, I'm going to say Kriya Shema when I get home, because there's nothing more for me to do. I'm about to go to sleep. I'm not going to do anything in my sleep. So therefore, I'm not being osek b'kfura, and therefore I'm pater. So Rav Shlomo Zalman seems to learn it very pragmatically. As long as you have an opportunity to be involved in the kfura, then there's an exemption. But if you're not going to be involved, or if you can't be involved, there's nothing to do. So he learns the concept apparently of you could be an onein l'chatzon. That half the time you could be an onein, and other times not. However, that seems to be a big chiddush. Rov Achronim seems to go against him. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, among others, among many other Achronim, who say, what are you talking? Ein aninis l'chatzon. You can't have a case where I'm an onein half the time. It's a categorical exemption. Once you're an onein, you're an onein mitchila ad sofa, And therefore, you would not say Kriya Shema Lamita if you're on a plane. Pashtus, you're an onain on the whole time, and therefore you do not make. But I guess some suggest anyway. In general, no one is the child of an onain because it's an issue to eat without a bracha. So some say if you can, you should listen to someone else's bracha. But either way, Pashtus is not like Rav Shlomo Zalman that you still are pater min mitzvahs and pater v'aser, and therefore on a plane as well. And therefore, it seems to be a similar shaila here. Let's say you're an onain on Friday, going into Shabbos, the burial will be Sunday. So what about mincha on Erev Shabbos? So can one daven mincha? So based on this Rav Shlomo Zalman, then, and in fact this is what some say, and in fact, and I heard someone told me b'shem Reb Mordechai Willig that he called up Rabbi Willig and he asked him, and this is what he told him to do. He should daven mincha a couple minutes before, a little later than he usually davens, which usually, and then you could daven mincha. Apparently, working with the Mahalach of Rav Shlomo Zalman, that at that point, 2 minutes before Shabbos, I can't be osik b'kfur anymore, and therefore I should daven mincha. And others disagree and say, so apparently the Emes Yaakov and others, and I heard also Rav Shechter also, says no, not to daven mincha. You're an onain to the end. You could still be thinking about your speech, the eulogy, who you're going to invite. You're going to be thinking about tzarchei hameis, and therefore it extends to go to mincha. So I thought that was the pashtus, like Rav Shechter, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, that even mincha you'd be exempt. However, based on Rav Shlomo Zalman, there's room, so, to machlokas poskim, so, yesh al mi lismov, you speak to your local posek to decide which route you're going to take. So just to summarize, we talk about the Petor of onain patam in our mitzvahs. The onain is exempt from mitzvahs, and we pointed out that based on the principle of yesh kolach v'yach chacham l'akord v'ator b'shei v'al, and as the Taz and others point out, it's limited not to something which isn't a furish b'kra. That's why we have meal on Shabbos. That's why you can't nick shofar completely. So we pointed out, what about Bizman Hazeh? That since really we give everything over to the Chevra Kadisha, so do you become Chayev in mitzvahs? Because it says so the Chachmas Adam thought so, and no, the Rita says no, it's not true. It's only people who are osek. They were osek and now they're finished and they're going back home. But someone who hasn't been osek is still going to be being osek in other matters, not physically with the mates, but making phone calls, preparing. So that's also part of the exemption of aninus. And that's the question: is how far do you take it? Is there like Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rav Shechter, others? Is a categorical heter. Once you're pater min mitzvah, you're pater mitchila ad sova. Of course, over Shabbos you're chayiv, but when Shabbos is over again, then that'd be a separate share. What is it only to Havdalah? But Pashtus, he would be exempt from mincha erev Shabbos, and once he's makabel Shabbos, so he could daven uchol dodi, and according to Rav Shlomo Zalman, no, it's not categorically. As long as you have the potential, at least to be osik b'kfura. If you're on a plane and you can't do anything, or perhaps a couple of minutes before Shabbos, where there's nothing more to do, so then you would be chayev in the mitzvah. So that's a discussion among the poskim. How broad does the exemption of Petor mitzvahs, is it categorical, or there are times within the aninus period you could be pater, and there are times where you could be chayev. There's a concept we have in the Gemara in Chazal, ones rachmana patre, that someone does an act under duress, so rachmana, the Torah, patre, you're exempt. So that's the whole discussion. Exempt meaning there's no culpability, there might be some, but as a general rule, if you do something under duress, we don't consider it your action per se. So there's a interesting discussion in the Achronim and as well as in the Rishonim on what happens if one is ones and ratzon behadi hadadi. Let's say simultaneously you're under duress and you're doing something willingly at the same time. How could you be ones and ratzon at the same time? And in fact, we say al cheshach ones uvaratzon. So Rabbi Chanan discusses it, the Beis Halevi, others, that let's say someone, a Jew, who is commanded in kashrus to eat kosher, however he's not observant, and he goes to a non-kosher restaurant for lunch on a regular basis. Let's say he goes to McDonald's. And one day he's on his way to McDonald's and he's right by in front, and someone comes over and walks over to him and says, with a gun in his pocket, he claims, and he has one, and he says, "Are you Jewish?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "I'm going to kill you if you don't eat from McDonald's." So he goes into McDonald's and he orders the lunch special, whatever he orders, and he eats the food. So that's a case of ones and ratzon. On one hand, he's ratzon, he does it all the time. On the other hand, in this specific case, he had a gun to his head. So normally that's halacha. You give up your life for the big three, for not to worship idols, not to be involved in illicit relations, not to murder someone. But kashrus isn't one of the things you give up your life for. It's a machlokes Rambam and Tosfos whether you're allowed to. According to the Rambam, Areza mischayev b'nafsho. If you're not obligated to give up your life, it's also to give up your life. And Tosfos says no. You're not obligated to, but you're never forced to do an Aveira. If you feel violating Shabbos or eating kosher, eating non-kosher, is this too much for you? So then under certain situations, one has the right to give up their life instead of eating the treif. So either we pass it like the Rambam that you don't have an option. So what happens in that case? He's ones and ratzon bahade hadade. So do we view him as an ones or not? So that seems to be a discussion in the Mefarshim. The famous Beis Halevi, that on the pasuk Vayeda Elokim, and God knew that when in the parasha Shemos, at the end of Parak Beis, or in that area, it says God knew. The Medrash says, "Halol ovdei avodah zara, v'halol ovdei avodah zara." The Jews worshipped idols and the Egyptians. So how come we're going to punish the Egyptians and not the Jews? So the Medrash says because the Egyptians did it for ratzon, but the Jews out the golus, the shibud, the terrible suffering. So therefore, I see God gives testimony. If not for the situation they were in, they wouldn't worship avodah zarah. Only God could give a testimony like that. But that's what the Medrash says, that God knows. Vayeda Elokim, and God knew this is the only reason they're doing it. So the Beis Halevi then discusses the issue about a case of a Machal Shabbos. Someone, let's say, is not a Shomer Shabbos. Let's say they usually drive. They go to the beach, they go to the golf game on Saturday, on Shabbos, and one time they're riding to the golf course or beach and they see someone just got ran over by a car, So they quickly take the person and they take him to the hospital. So the shaila is the time they're driving to the hospital, is that considered Chilul Shabbos or not? Because we know the halach is Pikuach Nefesh Doche Shabbos. So human life takes precedence over Shabbos. So therefore you're allowed to drive to save a life. So, but in the case of but in his case, he drives the car anyway. So the Beis Halevi writes, he has a very strict definition of ones. He says, the only time you define ones in the Torah is if the only reason I'm doing this action is because of the situation. If I would do it anyway, it's just that it happened to be forced also, that's not an excuse. Which is which is an important lesson to learn in life anyway, whether we paskin like the Beis Halevi or not. But many times people, the trick is probably not to fool yourself more than anyone else, but you make excuses. Well, I'm not going there because of X, Y, and Z. But it has nothing to do with it. Even if X, Y, and Z didn't happen, you're not going anyway. You don't want to go. So in terms of, it's easy to fool oneself in terms of that, but the Beis Halevi is talking about pi halacha. If you're ones and ratzon b'hadei adadi, so you're no longer considered anus, and that's what we said. Achei shalav ones of a ratzon. Let's say a person, you sleep in or some other thing. So on one hand, you're happy you slept in, or some, or different cases of ones and ratzon we'll get into at a later time. And Rabbi Chanan Wasserman seems to say similar. If you're ones and ratzon b'hadi adadi, you're considered ratzon. So based on this, based on the Beis Halevi, it would come out, some point out, that if you have a Shabbos emergency, and of course, all things being equal, which they never are, if you have two competent doctors, two doctors you go with all the time, let's say they're in the same group. One's both Jewish, one's a Shomer Shabbos, one's a non-Shomer Shabbos doctor, and you have a choice to which one to call on Shabbos. Do you call the Shomer Shabbos doctor or the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor? So based on the Beis Halevi, one should call the Shomer Shabbos doctor because the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor would be Machalo Shabbos anyway, so the fact you're calling him for a Shabbos emergency doesn't change the scenario. That would be according to the Beis Halevi. According to the Shitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, it's also, he agrees with the result, but for a different reason. In fact, he quotes the Beis Halevi, and it's not even clear. He's saying like a bitmiyah. Like he's saying, like, does the Beis Halevi actually really say this? That it's not considered onus? But he says for another reason, a much more pragmatic reason. He says that, let's say you call up the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor. Okay, Shabbos emergency, he could come. But then when you get there, it's not really, it's only a virus, the mother overreacted, the father, whoever it may be, and you see it's not really something that anything has to be done now. It could be either nothing has to be done, period, or you could wait until after Shabbos. So in terms of doing the other things, writing out the prescriptions, etc., all the other things, what to turn on lights for, what not to, once you find out it's not, once it's an emergency, you can do anything. But once you find out it's not, what happens afterwards, the Shitz Eliezer writes, you should call the Shomer Shabbos doctor, because he'll know all the ins and outs of Hilchos Shabbos about when it's an emergency, what to do, if it's not, what he can and what he can't do. So both the Beis Halevi and the Shitz Eliezer agree to the bottom line, but for two totally different reasons. The Beis Halevi says you're not considered an honest, you're considered a ratzon, and therefore called the Shomer Shabbos doctor. The Shitz Eliezer says you are called a honest, but only on the emergency part. On the other parts that don't warrant Chilul Shabbos, the non-emergencies, then that's what you want to Shomer Shabbos. However, when I first originally thought about the kasha, before I saw what anyone said, I thought actually to call the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor. And then later on, I think Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, I heard, or Moshe Feinstein, I'm in good company. They also felt that way based on the following svara. The way I thought was that, not like the Beis Halevi, if you're involved in a Shabbos emergency, not only is it not a usher, it's a mitzvah, saving lives. In fact, that's the whole discussion, the Gemara in Menachos. The Gemara in Menachos talks about someone who's fishing on Shabbos, and lo and behold, a bunch of fish, in addition to some fish popping up in the net, if you fish on Shabbos and you're successful, you violate Seder, a biblical prohibition of trapping. So, what happens, lo and behold, in addition to finding some fish, you find some child, a little toddler, fell off the river bank and into the water. So therefore you have a bunch of fish and you have a human being you saved. Are you labeled a Machalo Shabbos or not? So the Gemara in Menachos has a Machokas. I think Rav and Rav, different gerses who says what, whether we go Basa Maisa or whether we go Basa Machshava. If you go Basa Machshava, so the verse is labeled a Machalo Shabbos. That's what he did. He was Machalo Shabbos. That's what his intent was. If you go Basa Maisa, he did a tremendous mitzvah about Solas Nefashos, of Pikuach Nefesh. So that's the discussion over there in the Gemara. So similarly here, so let's assume we go Basa Maisa. The result is, once you're involved in a Shabbos emergency, even though your motivations might be different, it's not only okay, it's a mitzvah. So what is the Shomer Shabbos person going to be doing on Shabbos, and what is the non-Shomer Shabbos? The Shomer Shabbos person will be either Chatzi L'Hashem, Chatzi Lachem, he'll be davening in shul, learning, having a good meal, a Shabbos meal, having a good rest. He'll be involved in mitzvahs on Shabbos. But the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor, he could be working his lawn, going to the movies, beach, getting his car washed, going to the game mall, whatever people do when they don't keep Shabbos. So, at least, let's assume the emergency is going to take 6 hours. So the person who's Shomer Shabbos, he's involved in mitzvahs already, albeit not the great mitzvah of Tzolas Nefashos. So instead of being Machal, but for the non-Shomer Shabbos, instead of him being Machal Shabbos for 24 hours, he's only Machal Shabbos for 24 minus the time he's involved in emergency. Hence, that's why I thought calling a non-Shomer Shabbos doctor was better. So it seems to be a machokas among the poskim. It touches on the fundamental question if you're an ones and rutzin, if you're going to do the action anyway, but you happen to be an ones, which the Gemara talks about, ein ones begin. We have similar cases where a person makes a stipulation either to be married, divorced, if I'm back, and then you can't come back, but you don't come back, not because you don't want to come back, you don't come back because the bridge fell down or something happened, you can't get there. So that's a whole discussion in many areas of Shas. But regarding here, the Beis Halevi says you call the Shomer Shabbos doctor because the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor is considered to be labeled a Machalo Shabbos. Going to the Sittel Yezu, he's not labeled a Machalo Shabbos, not on the emergency, but on the extra things, writing a prescription or doing things that are necessary. Once you find out it's only a virus or it's not serious, therefore better to call the Shomer Shabbos doctor in order to deal with all the ins and outs of the situation. And Rav Moshe, Rav Yaakov, and others seem to go with the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor, because at least for those 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, whatever, 1 hour, whatever the time period the doctor's involved in Shabbos emergency, he was not only is he not labeled a Machal Shabbos, he's labeled doing the mitzvah of Pikuach Nefesh, like we say by the fishing on Shabbos, we go Basa Maisa, we live in the Olam Hasiya. We go by your actions, and therefore you should call the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor. So those are some of the, So these are some of the opinions regarding the issue of calling a Shomer Shabbos doctor versus a non-Shomer Shabbos doctor.